Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. I want to start today's video with a trigger warning. Today I'm going to be talking about books and memoirs that involve the topic of death. So if that's something that you don't want to think about or you don't want to talk about today, please feel free to click away from this video now. I've always found the topic of death interesting, and I think every human does to some capacity, but for some reason, for me personally, reading about death and reading about people going through terminal illnesses is something that I just find really human and really interesting and really fascinating. And today I'm going to talk about 3 memoirs that I've read recently that include death in some capacity. I promise you I'm definitely not a murderer, but I just think that because we're all going to die someday and there's still so much mystery and so much we don't know about death, I just find these kind of stories interesting, but also in a way comforting. Like, I read about other people going through terminal illnesses or knowing someone who's passed away, and it almost in a way makes me feel better about my own mortality. And I think that's probably why these kind of stories draw me in and attract me. And you definitely don't need to be obsessed with death to enjoy them, I don't think. I think that they have a real human element. Like I said, we're all going to die sooner or later, hopefully later. And I just think it's interesting to read about people who are going through the process or people who know someone who's going through the process. And yeah, I just like to get an idea of what I may be in for in the future. So with that said, the first book that I want to talk about today is In Love by Amy Bloom. And this is a book, like so many before it, that I just found randomly in my library one day. I just picked it up actually only 2 weeks ago. I only read it recently. I thought it was a memoir written by a woman who lost her husband in some capacity, but I didn't realize it would be so much about the dying process as it was. To give you a quick overview, Amy's husband was diagnosed with early onset dementia, and instead of going through the quite painful and awful process of having dementia for the last 5 to 10 years of your life and basically losing himself and his capacity to live life in any meaningful way, he chose to end his life through assisted suicide. In order to qualify for the assisted suicide, you need to be able to decide to go through with it of your own accord and be of sound enough mind to make that decision. And you also need to have a terminal illness. And I find, of course, with Alzheimer's, that means that your mind is degrading. I find it really interesting that Amy's husband was able to make this decision, dare I say, in the sweet spot where he knew that he had Alzheimer's, he was diagnosed with it, but he still had the capacity to make this decision himself. And I personally can completely understand why Amy's husband chose to do this. I actually work in aged care, so I work with clients that have dementia, and I've seen the worst of it, and it is a horrible, horrible thing to have to go through, not only for the person themselves, but for their family. And I think that it's an interesting thing in that he chose to not go through losing his mind, losing his memories. He would rather just have a clean end, if I can say that, and save himself the pain. And I can completely understand why you would want to do that. I also think it was completely selfless in that he chose to die so that he doesn't have to go through all that pain, but also so that Amy and the rest of the family don't have to go through it either. They don't have to watch him go degrade further and further. They don't have to care for him as he gets towards his end of life. And I think choosing to die instead of putting yourself and your family through that is not a decision that you would make lightly. And I find it so fascinating that that's still what he chose to do. I also found it so incredible to hear Amy's side of the story. And I say that because I know that if I was in Amy's shoes and my husband told me that he would rather die than live with Alzheimer's, I know a big part of me would be like, oh, please just see how you go. Like, just see if a treatment becomes available in the next 5 years. Just see, maybe it won't be that bad. I'll take care of you. Like, I feel like my instinct would be, please don't die. And yet, and I know Amy absolutely went through that as well. I'm sure she did. And she was emotionally devastated by it. Of course she was. But she still had the strength to support her husband in his decision. And she still had the compassion and the understanding to see why he chose to do what he did. And I find that to be so incredible. Just to read about this woman whose husband has chosen to die, and for her to be devastated, of course, but to still support him in the most loving, compassionate way. I think that's just amazing. And considering that I didn't know what this book was really about when I first borrowed it from the library, it has been a big eye-opener and a big look into what some people go through when they're faced with horrible diagnoses. So I highly recommend this one if you're interested in getting what I think is an unusual perspective on death. The next book I want to talk about is A Season of Death by Mark Raphael Baker. This book is pretty intense. Mark initially starts by saying that in the last 7 years he had lost his wife, his mother, and his brother. I think all to cancer, but I could be remembering that incorrectly. And so by the time he was writing this book, he had already gone through essentially a season of death, which I think is why the book is called what it is. And that just sounds like the most awful time to begin with. Like, to lose 3 of probably your closest family members is just hard to read, let alone hard to go through. And so this book already started in a bit of a heavy way. The book then also goes on to recount Mark's own diagnosis with cancer and the way that he then also deals with his own terminal diagnosis. This may be a bit of a spoiler, but Mark does eventually pass away. I find this book interesting because Mark has already lost 3 of his closest relatives, and then to be diagnosed with his own terminal illness, I just can't imagine what that would have been like. I just think that's the most horrible thing. And to read about his reaction to that diagnosis, I can't even find the words to talk about this book because it is pretty heavy. But in many ways, it's also quite nice to read. Like I said in the beginning, sometimes I read these books just to help me put life into perspective and to learn about where we're all headed sooner or later. And I feel like this book is a really good way for me to just see how someone else deals with a really crappy run in life. And I felt like Mark handled what's possibly one of the worst situations anyone could deal with a lot of dignity and a lot of grace and a lot of just understanding and compassion and surrender in a way. There was nothing he could do about his diagnosis. It was a seriously unfortunate series of events, and I just feel like it would be so easy for him to be mad at the world and pissed off and how could this happen to me? I've already lost my wife, my mum, and my brother, and now I'm going to die too. It'd be so easy for him to just be angry at everything, but instead he seems to have the most incredible love of life still, and to read that was really, really empowering and really wonderful. Like I said, it's not an easy read or a light read, but it is a very, very good read if you're interested. The next book I want to talk about is Stay True by Hua Su. This book is a memoir and recounts the author's time as a young man, particularly during college in America. And it starts off by talking a lot about how he doesn't really feel like he fits in, about the cultural differences that he feels as an Asian American, and just about, I guess, kind of almost standard teenage identity crisis kind of stuff. And it's very interesting to read, very relatable, I think, for a lot of us as well. And he spends the first half of the book talking about, his experiences as a young man trying to find himself, particularly around university life. And then about halfway through the book, he mentions that there was a really terrible incident involving his friend Ken, where Ken was killed during a carjacking. And this happened completely out of the blue, and the rest of the book kind of recounts the trauma that he went through because of this awful incident and the effect that it had on his life forevermore. Because the incident with the carjacking was only mentioned about halfway through the book, I did in a way find this book a little bit confusing, just because on one hand it's almost like a coming of age story about the author trying to find himself at university, and then all of a sudden it becomes a book about this extremely traumatic incident and his way of dealing with that trauma. And I wasn't sure which one the book was meant to be about per se. I think it's perfectly okay for people to write about whatever they want in their books. And so I'm not going to say you can't write half about a traumatic incident and half about your upbringing in the same book. I mean, there are no rules about that, of course. But I felt a little bit almost blindsided when the story was going on about university life and parties and finding yourself an identity and music, and then all of a sudden there was this huge traumatic incident, and I just wasn't prepared for that part of the book when I finally got to it. Even in the blurb of the book, as far as I can remember, it doesn't really allude to the fact that there's pretty much literally a murder mentioned or talked about in this book. And so I think, blindsided is definitely the right word, in that all of a sudden I was reading, normal kind of standard memoir, and then bam, all of a sudden the book's about something completely different. I've been reading a couple of other reviews online about this book, and there are a few people out there that also found the book to be a bit disjointed, so keep that in mind if you're thinking of reading it. But I don't think that I would let that stop me from reading it. I still think that this book is really interesting, and I think it takes a lot of courage to talk about the topics that Hua does talk about in this memoir. He's very open in how insecure he felt in himself sometimes, about how out of place he felt, how he tried to be cool but always felt deep down like maybe he wasn't. And then he is also very honest about his reaction to his friend's murder. And I think that that is the essence of this book, and that's really why I enjoyed it as much as I did, and why hopefully you will too if you read it. I want to end this video by also mentioning one more book that I haven't read yet, but I would really like to. It's called Mortals by Ross and Rachel Menzies. And I actually went to high school with Rachel Menzies. Ross is her father. Yeah, I haven't spoken to her in maybe 15 years or so, but I know her. I went to high school with her. I was in many classes with her. And I saw on Facebook a little while ago that she wrote this book with her father, and I think that is just so cool. I admire anyone who has the ability, the capability, the patience, the time, the intellect to write a book. I just think it's a really, really big achievement, and I'm so happy for her that she's written this book. And as I think is clear from this video, I am very interested in the topic of death. And unlike the other books that I've already mentioned that talk about death, but it's more of a memoir or a personal story about death, Rachel and Ross's book, I believe, is just about the human fear of death. And so I feel like it's much more death central, or death focused, if you could say that, than the other books that I've mentioned. And for that reason, I'd really like to read it, because I'm afraid of death. I'm sure we all are to some capacity, and I'd really like to learn their take on it. So that's on my to be read list, Mortals by Rachel and Ross Menzies. And when I do finally read it, hopefully sometime soon, I will let you know how I find it. That's all I've got for you today. Thank you so much for watching. If you're interested in any of the books that I've mentioned today, I'll leave links to them in the description box below. Thank you again, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.